So in this lesson I'm going to be showing you how to make rough puff pastry. So in your textbooks you'll see mentioned puff pastry, flaky pastry and rough puff pastry. The puff pastry and the flaky pastry are both made by a process called lamination, where you spread fat out onto the pastry as you're rolling it and fold it so you get the layers. Now that's quite time consuming to do. So a quick way of doing it is to make rough puff pastry, where it's a little bit like doing short crust pastry in that you rub the fat into the flour, but you don't rub it in so much, so you still see the fat in it. So it gives you streaks of fat, which as the pastry cooks, the fat melts and leaves the flaky layers. So short crust pastry, you wanted it to be slightly crumbly, and it was quite a tender sort of pastry, whereas a puff pastry tends to be a tougher pastry. You need it to be tougher for the layers, so it needs to be made with a flour that has a higher gluten content. So for this rough puff pastry we're going to use strong plain flour, so that's the same type of flour that you use for bread. So I've got 300 grams of strong plain flour, and I'm going to add to that a pinch of salt, and I'm going to sift them together into a bowl. So this helps to aerate the flour a little bit, as well as getting rid of any lumps that might be in the flour. And sieving the salt in mixes it in evenly with the flour. So when we were doing short crust pastry, we had half the weight of fat to flour. In the sort of flaky pastries, it's a higher proportion of fat. So in this recipe I'm using 3/4 fat to flour. So I've got 300 grams of flour. So I'm going to use 225 grams of butter. Now I'm using butter because I'm doing sort of quite a rich pastry, a sweet pastry, where you're going to be able to taste the flavour of it. And I think butter gives the best flavour. If you were going to be using it for something savoury like sausage rolls, then you could probably use half butter and half lard, and that would give you an even better flakiness, but the flavour's not quite as good as using all butter. So I've got my 300 grams of strong plain flour with a pinch of salt, and I'm adding 225 grams of butter. So I'm going to rub this in, but only quite gently. I'm still lifting my hands up from the bowl as with the short crust, so it can get some air into the mixture. But I'm going to leave it like that. So you can see I haven't rubbed it in very much at all. So now I've rubbed in the butter, I'm going to add some water to it. So if you remember, our main ingredients, 4 main ingredients for pastry are flour, fat, salt and water. So it's more accurate to actually weigh the water than to use a measuring jug. And I've got some water in a jug here, some cold water, and I added some ice cubes to it just to make sure that it was extra cold, because it gives the pastry a better texture to use cool water. So I'm going to pour out 150 grams of water, trying not to let the ice actually go into the pastry. Okay, so that's my 150 grams of water. Now I'm going to use a palette knife, we can use any round bladed knife, to start mixing it. I don't really want to get my hands in there too soon because the heat from my hands will start to melt the butter. So it does look a little bit dry, but I'm going to keep working it. I can add a tablespoon or 2 tablespoons of water if I need to, but I really want to try and do it with the minimum amount of water. So that is starting to come together. So I think that is enough water. So I'll just move the stuff over, put my hand in and bring it together into a ball. So I'm going to put some flour on my work surface. And take the pastry out. Just kneading it very, very lightly. You don't want to work it too much. A bit more flour and some flour on top. Now I'm going to start rolling this out. And I'm going to try and keep it in a rectangular shape. So I'm going to rotate it around. Rather than actually rolling at different angles, it's better to always roll forwards and backwards directly in front of you, because then you get more even pressure on the rolling pin than if you do it sideways. Try and keep it in a nice shape and use a little flour underneath and on top if it's sticking. It tends to stick more than shortcrust pastry does because you've got the fat in such large pieces that when that comes through on the surface as you're rolling it, it will be sticky. So as the fat melts, it will give layers, it will give holes in the pastry, so it gives the layering effect. But another way of getting extra layers is to actually fold the pastry. So I've got the pastry in a sort of rectangular shape and it's about 3 times as long as it is wide. What I'm going to do is take the top third of it, dust off any flour and fold it over, and then take this bottom third and fold that over. Then if I press it at the ends, that will seal air into pockets. So now I've got it like that, what I'm going to do is give it 1/4 of a turn. So now it's back lengthways and I'm going to re-roll it. You can see some butter coming through the surface there, so I'll just put a little bit more flour on it to stop it being too sticky. So widened it, and just slightly longer. So now I'm going to do that folding again. I'm going to fold about 1/3 of it over into the middle and then fold that section up and then press the edges down well and a couple of presses in the middle. Now I've worked this pastry quite a lot of handling, a lot of rolling, so the gluten needs time to relax so the pastry doesn't shrink as it's cooking. So got a piece of cling film and I'm going to wrap that up and I'm going to put that in the fridge for about 30 minutes. So I've chilled the pastry for a little bit, so the gluten has had time to relax. So now to make the palmiers, I'm going to unwrap it and dust the work surface with some flour and a little on top of the pastry as well. And then I'm going to roll it out. It's harder to roll out this time because it's been chilling, it's a little bit firm. So I'm going to be making sweet palmiers, so I'm using sugar on them, but you can use exactly the same technique and use cheese to make savoury ones. So I'm rolling the pastry, as you can see, but I always roll it keeping that side on the top. You don't flip it over, you keep it the same side up all the time. And rolling it in both directions, so to lengthen it the long ways and to roll it widthways as well. So I'll turn it quarter of a turn to roll it widthways. So what I'm going to do now is sprinkle some sugar over it. And a coarse type of sugar is better, so I'm using demerara sugar, or you could use granulated sugar, but it's not essential. If you don't have either of those types of sugar, just use caster sugar. So I sprinkled it mainly sort of in the middle. Now I'm going to fold one side over and then the other, so that they meet in the middle. Now I'm going to carefully roll down the top like that. And I'm going to widen it a little bit. Now just keep lifting it just to make sure that it hasn't stuck to my work surface. So now some more sugar on the top. Just make sure it's a nice straight shape. So these are like almost a sweet biscuit, you can serve them as. So I'm going to put a little bit more sugar on. On the plate I started off with 100 grams of the demerara sugar. Just going to roll this a little so it goes into the pastry. And then I'm going to fold it in half. Now I want to cut it into slices, but I don't want to damage my work surface. So I'm going to put it onto a chopping board, but that was longer than my chopping board was, so that's why I've just cut it in half. And then I'm going to cut it into 1 centimetre wide slices. And I've put my oven on. If you're using a fan oven, it should be at about 180. If it's not a fan oven, then 200 centigrade. And if you're using a gas oven, then it's gas mark 6. Okay, so the end slice will just be a very small one. Then I put them on their sides. If they open up, press them together slightly. So I'm going to spread these out on the baking sheet. Oops, I didn't cut all the way through that one. So hopefully these will open up a little bit during cooking. And I'm going to need a second baking sheet, so I'll do this tray first of all. And I'm going to sprinkle a little bit of sugar over the tops of them. So it may not need the full 100 grams of sugar, or if you do the very sweet, you might even need slightly more. The coarse sugar makes them go quite crunchy when they're baked. Okay, so that's got some sugar on all of them. So I'm now going to put this into the oven, and they take about 15 minutes. So put them in the top and set the timer. And then I'm going to cut the rest of this up in the same way. Now they're beginning to get golden, but I think they need to be a little browner. So I'm going to put the oven on for another 2 minutes. When I checked them, I didn't have the oven door open for too long. You don't want the temperature to drop inside the oven or they'll take longer. So try to open the oven door only as few times as possible and only have it open for as short a time as possible. Don't leave it open for too long. I can't exaggerate that enough because that's a common mistake that people make. Anyway, I'm going to leave those for another 2 minutes now. Okay, so these are looking nice and golden now. And the second baking sheet I did, I think they're done as well. So I'll take those out. Now I lined the baking sheet with a silicone liner, so it's a reusable one. If you don't have one of those, it's probably better to put the palmiers onto a sheet of baking parchment, because when they've got the sugar and it bubbles out as they cook, it could stick to a baking tray, so really it's best to line it. So you'll see that these have actually opened out, the fluffiness, the layers, and they've become more like a heart shape. So I'm going to transfer them all to wire racks and leave them to cool. Initially, I was just going to show you how to make the sweet ones, but as the savoury ones are my favourites, I've decided to show you those too, and then you can have the choice of whether you make sweet or savoury ones. So I've got my pastry that's been chilling, and I'm going to roll it out on a work surface, dusted with some flour. When you roll pastry, you should always keep the side that's on the top as the top. You should never be flipping it over that way, only rotating it so that it doesn't stick to the work surface. So as with the sweet ones, you need to start by rolling the pastry out. I think just slightly wider. Your pastry needs to be about 3 to 4 millimeters thick. So once I've rolled it, I'm going to put some grated cheese on the top. So I'm using vintage cheddar, a nice strong cheddar, so it should have a good flavour. And for an extra sort of slight kick to it, I'm going to sprinkle over some paprika. So you can either add paprika, or smoked paprika is nice as well, or cayenne pepper, or some mild chili powder. It's up to you, sort of whatever you have in your cupboards. Or another thing that's quite nice is to spread the pastry with either some mustard or some pesto before you start putting the cheese on top. So I put the cheese on, fold the sides in, and then, oops, it's stuck a little bit, so I'm going to use some more flour. So I need to roll that quite gently to begin with to make sure it's sealed. That's it. And now I can roll it to lengthen it widthways slightly. And then some more cheese. So that was 125 grams of cheese that I had. To make it extra cheesy, you could sprinkle some Parmesan cheese on top of this as well, some freshly grated Parmesan, and some paprika. I'll use all that cheese up, and I'm going to roll it a little into the pastry. We'll all get stuck on the rolling pin. And fold it in half. Again, it's too long for my chopping board, so I'm going to cut it in half and cut one half at a time. So into 1 centimetre thick slices. So when I did the sweet ones, I sprinkled some sugar on top of them when I was baking them, but I'm not actually going to put any extra cheese on top because that might stop the pastry from sort of opening up and puffing as much. So with these I'm just leaving the pastry sort of plain on the tops. So they look sort of quite narrow and straight when you put them on the baking sheet. So when they're cooked you can really see a difference when they've puffed up. So again, these are going to go in the oven initially for just 15 minutes. I'll put the other half on another baking sheet. So I've set the timer for 15 minutes. And the temperature is 200 degrees centigrade in a conventional oven, 180 in a fan oven or gas mark 6. So I put the timer on for 15 minutes for these, as I did with the sweet ones, but they weren't quite done. So I've actually given them another 5 minutes, so they've taken 20 minutes altogether. I think that sheet is done as well. So I'm going to slide these onto a wire rack as well. So they're smelling really good. That one's opened up quite a lot. You might be able to see that, I hope, in the video. So that shows, oops, just how flaky the pastry was. So it still gives a very flaky result, although it's a rough puff pastry. And as I said at the beginning, it's not quite as flaky as if you do a real puff or flaky pastry, but it does give very good, very acceptable results. But what we will look at next is doing a flaky pastry, so you get to practice doing some lamination of the fat as well.